Hi folks, this is Dr. Rob Cywes and I am the Carb Addiction Doc. Today is the second part of a little mini-series that we're doing about the blood work that we typically do in my office. And today we're going to talk about diabetes blood work, sugar blood work. And I'm going to again focus on a few things that we look at in terms of diabetes management. We're going to look at, when I do blood work for diabetes, I look at some of the inflammatory markers. I'm not going to discuss that in detail today. But the first blood test that I always call a CMP or Comprehensive Metabolic Panel gives me information. And I'm not also, by the way, in these numbers looking at consequences of diabetes. We're not going to look at kidney damage. We're not going to look at all of those things. We're just going to look at the diabetic numbers for the diagnosis and the effective management of the diabetes itself. So the first one is a CMP, and I'll go through what I'm looking for there. The second number we look at, everybody should get a Cpeptide and an insulin. Most endocrinologists don't do that, which is crazy, and I'll explain to you why. We will then look at your glucagon number, and we'll look at your hemoglobin A1C. We ordered these blood tests. And finally, at least once, you need to have a GAD65, and an insulin antibody 1 and 2, insulin autoantibodies checked. And it's very, very important, in my opinion, that we check this. Why? Because in my practice, between 20 and 30% of the diabetics that I see for the first time are incorrectly diagnosed. Incorrectly diagnosed. And I don't care if you've got type 1 diabetes, LADA, type 2 diabetes, or gestational diabetes. Those are the tests. Well, what about an insulin tolerance test? What about a glucose tolerance test? What about HOMO-IR? What about... That's all I need, folks. If I need anything else, we'll do a deep dive into it, of course. Of course we will. But those are the numbers I need to be able to help you to help yourself in clinical practice. The other stuff is academic. The other stuff is academic. So let's break this down. The first thing to understand is there are two types of diabetes, essentially. There is the type 1 equivalents where you do not produce insulin from your pancreas. That is where the human body cannot produce adequate insulin because those cells have been damaged somehow. So you need insulin to manage your blood sugar. And the only real difference, in ideal circumstances, the only difference between a type 1 diabetic and me who's not diabetic is that a type 1's diabetic medication needs to come from a pump or an injection, whereas mine comes from my pancreas. Okay, now there's more to that, but essentially there should be no difference between a type 1 diabetic and me when it comes to overall health. Type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance. That is where you produce enough insulin, where you're getting it from a needle, from a pump, or from your pancreas, but your cells are resistant to that. They're afraid of you. They're petrified of the sugar you're throwing at them, and they have shut the front door, changed the lock, and thrown away the key. They are petrified of you. That's type 2 diabetes. And a lot of latent autoimmune diabetes is where you're slowly heading toward a lack of insulin production cells. And there's a honeymoon period. It can last anywhere from a year to 7 years to 10 years or longer. That honeymoon period, you've got to be cognizant of that. And gestational diabetes is an early form of insulin resistance, typically, that is caused by this parasite growing in your belly called a fetus. And your response to that. So to look at the different patterns, the craft table, yeah, they're nice, they're great to do in the lab, but they don't matter. Because you're not going to change what you're doing based on your craft pattern. They're great for me as a doctor to be analyzing from a science perspective to look at how different people function, but they're irrelevant if you're pregnant. We use the diagnosis of diabetes to make the diagnosis, to be able to medicate patients if they need medication transiently or permanently, and to give them guidance on how to eat and drink. It's that simple. That's what you check these numbers for. For medication, should it be needed transiently and permanently, and to make dietary alterations. That's all we're after. And the dietary alterations are not dissimilar for all the different types of diabetes. If you don't eat carbohydrates, you cannot have type 2 diabetes. Whether a 1, or a GD, or me. And I'll challenge anybody on that. Because type 2 diabetes, by definition, is insulin resistance. And it may take 4 or 5 years to go away, average 18 months to 2 years. But you can get rid of the type 2 component. So let's look into the numbers. Why do I do a CMP? Well, the major reason I do it is because I get your blood sugar, your blood glucose. What is a normal blood glucose? And Richard Bernstein and I were on a panel the other day, and he gave a great talk. And if you don't know who he is, Google him, Richard Bernstein. But it's interesting that he uses a normal blood sugar, an average normal blood sugar of 83. In my practice, we use 85. Pretty much the same number. 85 is a normal blood sugar, and ideally you should be at or slightly below that number. Doesn't matter what type of diabetes you have. Certainly, I never like my patients to go above 110, except under very specific circumstances. I saw a 150 and a 170 when I was out in the yard working and exhausted, or when I was running up a bridge after a 10-mile run. But it lasted a very short period of time. That was a combination cortisol liver effect under emotional and physical duress. So that spike helped me run away from a saber-toothed tiger. But other than that, it came down right quickly. But blood sugar is typically above 110. I get very scared when they go above 100. And certainly an average blood sugar around 85 is what we target. So the CMP I use for blood sugar, it gives me other metrics. It gives me some kidney metrics. We're not going to talk about those right now. Next two numbers, Cpeptide and insulin. And as a combination, they are very, very important because you use those two numbers to look at insulin production capacity. And if somebody's eating the standard American diet and their C-peptide is not elevated, that's a huge red flag that they have either LADA or type 1 diabetes. Certainly, if your insulin level is below 1 and you're eating the standard American diet, in other words, you've got a high blood sugar and a high A1C, you have type 1 diabetes. You have type 1 diabetes. Now, I've got a whole group of patients, typically my veteran carnivores, who are fat-adapted, insulin-sensitive, and their C-peptides are all below 1. Their insulins are in the 1.5 to 4 range. Most endocrinologists will call those immediately type 1 diabetics, so they never see those numbers. But their blood sugars are in the 60s and 70s. Their A1Cs are in the high 4s, low 5s. They don't have diabetes. They're insulin sensitive, which is the holy grail of diabetes management, no matter if you're a 1 or a 2. But you need a C-peptide and an insulin to determine whether you are starting out as a 1 or a 2. And if your insulin C-peptide is high, even if it's just moderately high, anything above 1.5, you should be able to come off your insulin. Or you should be able to come off your diabetes medication. Hard work, yes. Not everybody does. But you can. You can. Yep, you can. And the ideal insulin number for me is definitely below 6, ideally below 4. 4 units in the bloodstream to regulate your blood sugar. But then your blood sugar needs to be at around the 85 mark, or certainly below 100. Otherwise, you're a type 1. We look at ketones. And they help me to determine where somebody is. Diabetic ketoacidosis, high blood sugars, high ketones. But some people on certain medications can have relatively normal blood sugars and still be in normoglycemic ketoacidosis. SGLT2 inhibitors, very dangerous drugs, heavily promoted by the drug companies. Something I don't use in my practice because I try to get people off that. Dangerous. Then we look at glucagon. Because glucagon and insulin should be working opposite each other. And I try to get all my blood work done early morning fasted. Because that's when your glucagon number should be the highest. But your insulin number should be low. If they're both elevated, we have a problem. We have paradoxical gluconeogenesis. Your pancreas is producing sugar. Your liver is producing sugar in the face of an already high blood sugar. That tells me that you are profoundly insulin resistant. How does that work? Okay, so let's break this down for a second because this is important to understand. Insulin gets released under normal circumstances by the pancreas in response to systemic blood sugar. Because what the pancreas sees, the arterial blood supply to the pancreas is systemic arterial blood supply. So what the beta cells of the pancreas sees to release insulin is sugar on the back end of the liver, your blood sugar before it's gone to your organs. So it's the highest systemic blood sugar that it sees. That's what triggers insulin release. Glucagon release, a little bit predicated by your blood sugar, but mostly related to insulin levels. Because the alpha cell has insulin receptors on it, the GLUT receptors, the insulin receptors that allow sugar to enter the cell. And if your alpha cell is insulin resistant, then no matter what your blood sugar is, sugar doesn't get in the cell. And when your intracellular blood sugar is low in those alpha cells, those alpha cells are releasing glucagon because what they see is low blood sugar. Well, at least low intracellular sugar. They don't know what your blood sugar is. So the paradox is this, that insulin gets released to control blood sugar and glucagon gets released based on intracellular sugar levels. And if the gradient between your bloodstream and your cells is high because of insulin resistance, now that glucagon is causing the liver to produce a lot of sugar in the face of a high blood sugar, making the situation worse. And that's where we use metformin. Not difficult to understand, but if you don't measure your glucagon levels, you don't know. And most doctors don't. So those are the numbers I look at. And then hemoglobin A1C is not a marker of diabetes because it doesn't tell me if you're a 1 or a 2 or whatever it is. It tells me how broken your system is. It tells me how chronically elevated your blood sugars are. So A1C is a tracking marker for me because I want to see that come down. But the absolute number just tells me how poor your diet is and how poor your management has been. The ideal metric, which we're going to talk about, is, I don't have one on me right now, but is a Dexcom 6 or a CGM of some sort to see what your blood sugars are every 5 minutes, even while you're asleep. That is another critical tracking marker. And then the final set of numbers, your insulin autoantibodies, the GAD65, the IA2, and the insulin autoantibodies, tell us whether or not you have autoimmune disease against your insulin production. And there's a whole subset of people that have developed, because of their high carbohydrate, high grain consuming diet, antibodies against insulin. We call that LADO, latent autoimmune diabetes of adulthood. And while their blood sugar and their diabetes indices may look like a 2 or may look like a 1, we've got to see where they are, because often they're in a honeymoon period and you may be able to stabilize them or possibly even reverse that honeymoon period by normoglycemia, by aggressively managing their blood sugars. Same thing with Kraft tables and gestational diabetes. I don't need a glucose tolerance test where you get somebody to consume 75 grams of sugar and then measure their blood sugars and their insulins. I don't need that. I don't need that. These numbers tell me what I need to know from a therapeutic perspective. From a categorization for a science paper, absolutely useful. But to talk to you as the patient, I don't need those numbers. But that's what we do when we look at diabetes. And most endocrinologists, I don't need that, I don't need that. That's why we get a third plus of our patients misdiagnosed and sure as hell poorly managed. Because endocrinologists don't look at the numbers that you need to look at. Why? Because they're not treating blood sugar. They're treating grams of carbohydrates. They're treating grams of carbohydrates consumed by the diabetic, not the consequence of their blood sugar that's going to kill them. And they've resigned themselves to the fact that diabetes is a chronic disease that never goes away and eventually will kill you. And that is bullshit. I am the Carb Addiction Doc. There's my word. If you want to learn more about your diabetes, give us a shout. If you're a 1 or a 2, a Lara, if you're not sure, give us a shout. Because we haven't even talked about the difference between insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia that we see in the obese people who are never going to have diabetes. But often their doctors, oh, you're pre-diabetic. No, they're not. There's no way on God's earth they'll ever be diabetic because of their genetics. We can figure that out for you. We can help you to work through that. Give us a text or a phone call, 561-517-0642, and we can get this blood work done with you and help you to interpret this and then help you to change what you're doing to improve the numbers should they be off. If you like these videos, throw a few dollars at us. PayPal, robert@jackschildren.com, and Patreon @CarbAddictionDoc. It's all charitable because that's what goes into making these videos free. Thank you. Take care.